It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting through my website, emailrevealer.com. You can just contact me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Our archives you can find at Spreaker.com. And if you go to our archives at Spreaker.com, you can sign up for free. There's a chat room. You get an email notification when we put up new content. And also, too, I do a live show there every Friday night. And if you look through those archives, you can find our guest today, Mike Marinacci. We had him on previously about his book, Mysterious California. Now, he's been gone for a while, man. We haven't had this guy back for a while, but he's here now. He's written his new book. It's not even, the ink's not even dry yet. We're waiting for the ink to dry. It'll come out on July 6th. Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, LSD, Cannabis, and Spiritual Sacraments in Underground America. Now, you can find Mike Marinacci, Marinacci on Instagram at Psychedelic Cults. And you can find him on Facebook, too, as well. He's got a group just for this book. It's called Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches. Mr. Mike Marinacci, are you there?
Hello, Ed.
It's been a long time, right, my friend?
Yeah. I miss being on your show.
It's been about 10 years. Remind the audience, though, anybody who's been around for 10 years, who is Mike Marinacci?
Well, Mike Marinacci is an author and researcher who is interested in the fringe aspects of both California history and culture and of religious and spiritual history. I'm coming up on my 5th published book here, and that's, of course, Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches. I live in Marin County, which is north of San Francisco in California. And my latest book, I think, is easily my best. It's really the product of over 30 years of research and some participant observer work. And it's a subject that's fascinated me for a long time and really is something that has not been covered, I think, as deeply or systematically as I've done in Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches. Basically, what I have done is looked at the history and activities and personalities that are involved in what I call the entheogenic religious underground. These are groups in modern North America that use illegal substances, usually illegal, such as LSD or peyote or cannabis or psilocybin or what have you, as religious sacraments, as substances that allow the members of these groups to have an experience with the divine, with God, whatever you define that as. And really the phenomenon began in this part of the world, in this part of history, with the Native American church. Peyote use in North America goes back thousands of years. But it was not really an organized activity recognized by a state or federal government until 1918, when the Native American Church incorporated in Oklahoma. And they were immediately very controversial, and it fought for decades for the First Amendment right to take peyote in their ceremonies. And what happened was, in their wake, with the interest in psychedelic substances outside of Native American circles that really started going in the 1950s, other groups began springing up and saying, hey, why should it just be American Indians? We, white people, black people, whomever, are also having these fantastic transcendent experiences with these chemicals that are changing our lives. We want to have communities where we can do this too. And they ran up against a whole different set of problems than the American Indians did, because there was no traceable history of the use. The Native American church really got grandfathered in because they were able to prove, well, this has been going on for centuries or millennia. And I cover in Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, I start with the Native American church and their history and ceremonies and legal troubles, and then move on from there into the whole history of groups in their wake outside of the indigenous North American world who have adopted peyote or LSD or marijuana as holy sacraments.
Mike, let me ask you this. Mm-hmm. I recently had Don Lattin on the show. I think you know him,
yes.
right? Yeah.
I know Don.
Yeah, and he wrote a book, pretty much the same field, God on Psychedelics. He's written a lot of books about psychedelics, right? Mm-hmm. And I guess he's about 70 years old. I know he's older than me. And it was interesting to me that he's still using this stuff, man. He's got the guts to go out there and use it. I've used it in my youth, in my 20s. Yeah. And I would be afraid to use it now. And he's even using like ayahuasca and stuff like that. Now what about Mike Marinacci? What's your personal experience with this type of experimentation?
Well, first time, I had cannabis a few times as a teenager, and then the first time I did anything genuine, well, I would just say genuinely psychedelic, but what's recognized as a major psychedelic was in college when I did psilocybin and just had a really changing experience with it. As I put it in the introduction to Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, I touched God, or something that I considered a transcendent state of being and state of consciousness, and did it a few more times, and also did LSD a few more times in my 20s, and then I think up to my 30s, and had very similar experiences. I'm 62 years old now, and really the last in my middle age and older, I've pretty much stuck with cannabis, but I would like to do psychedelics, something like psilocybin, one or two more times in my dotage, just to see how it affects me now, as opposed to what it was like when I was in my early 20s. I respect people who really do this as a path, but it's been something that's been largely more of an academic fascination for me than a way of life. I'm interested in a lot of different sort of the different ways people have found God or found a higher state of being. And one that just has not been covered very much, is at least on the level of when these become sacred communities, would be the entheogens. And in Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, I really get into the history of this phenomenon in North America.
How about I guess the popularization, right? The mainstream usage of psychedelics, LSD, mushrooms, back in the '60s. Timothy Leary. I guess everybody's attention, their focus would go directly to Timothy Leary.
Yes.
No, and Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, Merry Pranksters, all those guys, right? Mm-hmm. And what do you make now? We hear all these theories that these were like government operations or some kind of experiment, MK Ultra type experimentations. What do you make of that?
Well, from what I've been able to find out, MK Ultra really was going in the 50s and early 60s. By the time the hippie movement emerged and the sort of psychedelic explosion of the 60s, it had been pretty much given up on for the most part by the spooks. I think they found that they really could not control the experience. They really could not control people after they've had the experience. It wasn't really effectively weaponizing users for clandestine purposes, which is, I think, what they wanted. Now, in Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, I do deal with some individuals and groups that I think may have had their roots in MK Ultra, but kind of went rogue, went on their own different paths. I mean, there's been speculation for many years that Timothy Leary, who we know ratted out members of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, who I covered in the book, may have been in bed with the CIA or other groups as well, and there's really been no hard evidence that I've seen of that. I think really it can be summed up by what Hunter S. Thompson once said about the CIA using LSD in experiments. He said it was a substance that's too small to see and too big to control.
So then the focus of your book is more on the spiritual benefits, I would say.
Not so much even the spiritual benefits, on the histories and practices and the personalities of the people who started and participated in these groups, who are very colorful, kind of outlaw characters. And the beliefs, the way they affected the world outside of them and the outside around. I really would not estimate the impact of the original sort of explosion of psychedelics uses in the 60s, and then the revival in the 1990s, and what we're going through now, which is almost a mainstreaming of these chemicals and the experiences that go with them. I mean, the emphasis right now with things like psilocybin, as far as moving them into the mainstream, seems to be very much therapy-oriented. But there is also this element of the spiritual, too, of really using them to expand one's consciousness and have experiences that are transcend normal consciousness, that are in the realm of the sacred, rather than just healing and therapy.
Yeah, what do you make of that? They talk about microdosing mushrooms in order to treat depression and even like addictions, like alcoholism, things like that.
I think there's probably some very good potential use of that. My objection to microdosing is, and to a certain amount of the therapeutic promotion right now, is the commercialization of it. And so much of it seems to be oriented, well, you have problems in the world. If you microdose acid, if you microdose psilocybin, whatever, it'll make you a better person. And so much of the definition about a better person means a more functional member of your corporation.
Right,
You'll be more productive. You'll be
a better
more
consumer.
You'll earn more money. Yeah. You'll be a better consumer. Yeah. And I am very much against that. I think it's inevitable, given the society we live in and the political and economic systems we have here, but to me that is a worse misuse than to me a far more worse use than a far worse misuse than using these things purely recreationally. This is where we get into, again, maybe this is what back in the 50s the CIA were looking at. Let's reprogram people's brains with these chemicals for our purposes, not so that they can be freed of all the illusions and BS of daily life here in the 21st century world, but so that they can be higher functioning in the systems we want them to be functioning in.
That's interesting, because I was going to ask, I says, well, who's manufacturing this stuff today? Because, back in the old days, we knew it was these, like, outlaw chemists. But today, with all the illicit drug market, we have these cartels, these huge labs doing it now. And so, and you're right, we're consumers, they came up with this expression, consumers, because we consume the products they want to sell us,
Yes.
Yeah, and we're just the ones that just, use it up. So then the motivations possibly today of the people who are manufacturing this on a scale would be for that capitalist motivation. Who is manufacturing this stuff these days?
Well, I could not tell you. As far as I know, LSD is continuing to be produced by underground chemists. One of the reasons I have not used it in over about 30 years is because I do not trust the quality control there. I think it was a very different chemical, and in a very different form back in the 60s when it was still being made by Sandoz, or when you had fairly controlled, fairly knowledgeable people like Owsley Stanley III doing it. Now you don't know what you're getting. I think the reason psilocybin has really pushed to the forefront in this world is because it is so easy to create. You just get the spores and food for the spores and an environment for them, and hey presto, in a few days you've got fairly potent hallucinogenic mushrooms. You don't need to do the bathtub chemistry for them. I have no idea what's going on with a lot of this stuff. That was not really the focus of psychedelic cults and outlaw churches. I was interested more in the groups that have formed around their use as spiritual sacraments. And in the book, I do get into a bit of the lore about the history of synthesizing the drugs. I do have quite a bit there about Alexander Shulgin, who is really the pioneer of creating new tryptamines and other chemicals, and I have a big chapter on the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, who have fascinated me. They started out in Southern California in the early 60s as a sort of outlaw car club and gang, and then they started doing LSD and transmogrified into this worldwide syndicate that was distributing LSD in the form of the famous orange sunshine tablets all over the world, and there's rumors about them being linked to various underworld organizations, and one of the people that was very much involved with them, Ronald Stark, was a very shady character, and I get into his story in Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches. It's really, it's a kind of an obvious question, but it's one that I touch on as far as historical aspects. But as far as today, it's something I didn't really discuss too much because I didn't really have the information beyond. And again, as I said, psilocybin seems to be really the one that's moving the quickest towards mainstream respectability because it's the easiest to make of all of these things.
I got to tell you, I don't want to get on too far on a tangent, but I had a mushroom expert once and he tells me, he says, Ed, there's no way that there's these psilocybin mushrooms that they're growing in America is organically just showing up here. And he went into the whole history of it too, how it has to be like under logs, under certain stuff. And he says, there's no way this stuff is just popping up all over the place. It has to be something behind it. But I don't want to get too far off on a tangent. Let me ask you this then, okay? Because cults and churches, because I know we mentioned off there, like they have like 18 chapters just on the cults and churches. Who are some of these cults and who are these churches? Are they still around today?
In the book, in Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, the groups I discuss, some of them are still around, some of them are just historical. Really, the book is kind of a snapshot of what this scene looked like in early 2022, because that's when I submitted my manuscript to the publisher. There have been so many that have popped up since then, in the 18 months or so since then, and new controversies and things like that I couldn't really work into the book. As I said before, the book starts with the Native American Church, who are very well established and have been around since 1918 and have been through all sorts of legal trouble. And then you have all the spin-offs from them. I discuss groups like the Church of the Awakening and the Peyote Wave Church of God, who were the first ones to really take peyote out of the Native American world and start having people outside of who are non-Native Americans using it and coming up with ceremonies and practices that would for their own organizations that would tend to lead people into the realm of the sacred and the transcendent. My sort of subsection about LSD starts with Timothy Leary, and he had 3 different organizations he went through. The first was IF, which was purely academic, and they treated LSD as a whole kind of extended clinical experiment in its use, where they were going down to Zihuatanejo in Mexico and having people dose down there and then recording their impressions and being very scientific. And then once he moved to Millbrook in upstate New York, which is there's a very large and famous estate there that was owned by and I think still is owned by the Mellon family, where you have, again, this is where the conspiracy researchers get a little interested because of the connection between them and the very, very wealthy and powerful old money East Coast family and the psychedelic revolution. He had a group there called the Castalia Foundation, which was more sort of experiential and therapy-oriented. And then finally, they started the League for Spiritual Discovery, LSD, which was explicitly religious, really saw the use of LSD and the use in a sacred context as a new religion that was emerging, and that this was his baby, his way of kind of promoting it as a spiritual group. Now, that fell apart because there was just so much police harassment of Millbrook and lots of internal drama, which I get into in Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches. And then you had several other groups that made LSD the center of their worship. The Neo-American Church, which also was headquartered in Millbrook for a while and was led by a real wild man named Art Kleps. He, like Timothy Leary, was a former psychologist, and they took the whole, not so much the experience less seriously, but the whole form of being a church less seriously. They were very much like a sort of prototype of the Discordians or the Church of the Subgenius, or the what do they call this spaghetti monster, the Flying Spaghetti Monster group. It was very jokey and silly, their symbology and titles and rituals, but at the same time they were quite serious about the transformative nature of the LSD experience. I also, in Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, discuss psilocybin-based groups, and I have a pretty big section on cannabis. I think there's a kind of a controversy within that world over whether cannabis is genuinely an entheogen or not. I tend to think it is. It is certainly linked in the experience with the more powerful and more illegal psychedelics. And to, as I always say, to paraphrase something attributed to, excuse me, I'm just spacing out here. Something attributed to Mickey Spillane. Anyone who can't have a psychedelic experience on cannabis isn't trying. It's you have enough of it, and you have, at least in my experience and the people I've known, something akin to, say, a good strong mushroom trip. It does seem to take one, if used properly and enough and in the right context, to the same place that acid or the other major psychedelics will. So I included cannabis in psychedelic churches, psychedelic cults and outlaw churches, for that very reason. And I traced the history of that as well, starting with the Rastafarians in 1950s Jamaica, and how they, one of the groups there established a very big stronghold here with a group called the Ethiopian Zion Coptic Church.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, they became they were some of the biggest smugglers of cannabis in the late 70s and early 80s, and became very wealthy and influential. And then they got stomped on by the feds, and I get into the story in the book. And some more obscure but equally interesting groups that use cannabis or marijuana as a holy sacrament. And then I also have I also get into what we have now with ayahuasca, an organization that is really kind of blown up in the last 20 years and become a big thing. And we were talking earlier about the corporate world and entheogens, and that seems to be a very big thing there for their people to go to Peru or whatever and have these experiences. And I discuss a group called Ayahuasca Healings, which really kind of brought it into the mainstream and commercialized the whole experience. And
yeah, let me stop you there for a second, because I was going to ask you about ayahuasca, and that is in my notes here that I was just about to ask you. Why don't you just explain to people what ayahuasca is, what the history of it is, and what is going on with it today? Why is it suddenly everyone's promoting it, so like the celebrity class is suddenly promoting this stuff?
Okay, ayahuasca is a tea that is brewed from two different plants. Usually, the plants are yahe and chacruna, but other ones can be substituted for chacruna so long as they've got a DMT in them. Now, the plants themselves, these are legal to possess in the United States. Brewing a tea to extract the DMT from them, well, then you get into Schedule 1. Then it's very illegal. And I think there's several reasons it took off in the U.S., part of which is because you can legally own the plants, you just can't brew them to get the DMT going in them. So it's an easy way to, easy and probably fairly cheap way to create a psychedelic substance. I think a lot of it is also due to the work of Terence and Dennis McKenna.
Right.
In the 1990s, they really brought the world's attention to these in books like True Hallucinations because of their own ethnobotanical work in South America, taking these substances and learning about their use in the indigenous cultures. It's hard to underestimate their influence in the whole thing. I think a lot of it is exoticism too. They have all the kind of myth around ayahuasca and the various visions and the kind of shamanic sensibilities. I think a lot of people really kind of dig the whole idea of, okay, we're going to be going back to being tribal people here and connecting with the earth and connecting with the great spirits. There's a whole kind of image that it has that's unlike even peyote or psilocybin, which are also substances that started with the indigenous peoples of the New World. I think those would be the main reasons I would see why it just became almost mainstream so fast. And there's also the element of you literally take a trip to take it until Ayahuasca Healings tried to start doing it legally in the United States. The thing was, well, you always went to Peru or Bolivia or Brazil or whatever, and you hooked up with a native shaman down there, and you had him guide you through the whole thing. And of course, that's been much more commercialized now. Now they have retreats and nice lodging where you're fed well and don't have to go into the jungle and can have it all in the have your whole experience in the company of a Western guide. So,
have you tried that?
No, I have not.
Yeah, me neither.
For a variety of for personal reasons, I don't really. I tried DMT many years ago, had a pretty wild experience, but these days I would shy away from it. But I have talked to people who have, and certainly in Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, it's the chapter about ayahuasca healings gets into the nature of the trip and the whole history of its usage and the legal issues right now. There are actually two churches in the United States where it is legal to use it there, and it was ruled in two different courts, one by the Supreme Court, one by, I believe, the Oregon State Supreme Court, that because these groups had come out of Brazil, where there is a demonstrable historical and ethnic precedent for using these substances, it's okay for their American missions here. But if somebody else tries, the other people who've tried to have it be legalized here out of U.S.-based churches have had a lot of problems, and there's still a lot of issues in current court cases and various other regions about, okay, is this a legitimate religious practice or not? And it's something that's still being worked out by the DEA and the American court system. But these two Brazilian churches, one of which is called Santo Daime, and the other one has a long, unpronounceable name that I can't think of right off the bat, are recognized as legal as churches where this can be done legally because they have demonstrable historical precedent for it back in Brazil.
I was going to ask you too. I guess we touched on this a bit. You mentioned bad experiences, bad trips. What do you make of that? We used to hear a lot of that. I guess in the government was trying to discourage us from using trying psychedelics. I had a bad experience. What do you make of that?
I think that's part of the whole experience. I think this is what Timothy Leary was talking about when he said the three things you have to be very much aware of if you were going to do entheogens are set, setting, and dosage. Set being your state of mind, your sort of internal being, and your purposes for taking them, and how you're feeling at the time, and what you're thinking. Setting, which is where you are physically, the environment around you, the people around you, the stimuli around you. And the third is the dosage, how much you're taking. And I think most cases of so-called bad trips are because one of those factors was not really taken properly into account. Now, I do have a account in Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches of a group called the Church of Naturalism, also known as Naturalism Incorporated, who specialized in doing what they call LSD rescue and therapy with people who were having bad experiences with LSD or other psychedelics, talking them down, maybe giving them psych meds or vitamins to deal with it, and I get into how they were able to get their hands on psych meds in Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches. And it is a big issue, and it is something that people have been grappled with for a long time. And in the book, I discuss how different groups have addressed that, and particularly this one in particular, the Church of Naturalism, whose story has really not been told. And their possible links to what we were talking about earlier, MK Ultra experimentation earlier in the history, early in the 1950s, and a very odd character who ran the organization. I mean, the organization really ended in Los Angeles with a series of murders. That it's funny that it's very hard to get the information about these things that happened. It's just kind of been buried. But I get into it in the book, and I discuss the work this organization, this individual did, bringing people down from bad trips and giving them therapy and giving them help in dealing with the psychedelic experience.
That is very interesting. I've never heard of that group myself. Now, but by the way, Hank Harrison, who I had on the show many, many times, the father of Courtney Love, and he worked with the Grateful Dead and was out there and doing all that kind of stuff. He claimed that was his role, traveling around with the dead and these characters, that he would be bringing down people from bad trips. Did you get a chance to talk to him?
I did not talk to him.
He would have loved to talk to you, man. He'd talk to you.
I'd love to chat with him.
He's passed away. He's passed away now, yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Okay, I was not aware of that. But, there were several people or organizations that were doing that. Another one, which I mentioned in Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, was the Psychedelic Peace Fellowship in New York. That was created by a very interesting character, Michael Itkin. Michael Itkin was raised in a Jewish family, but as a teenager, he converted to Christianity and became very attracted to the liturgical side of Christianity, to Catholicism and Orthodoxy and whatever, and he became a priest in a group called the Eucharistic Catholic Church, which was a group that had broken off from the Roman Catholic Church, and this is the 1950s, was a gay-friendly 1950s Christian church. Then he became a bishop. He was raised to the episcopacy, and through the 1960s and 70s and 80s, he ran a bunch of different organizations, these sort of non-papal Catholic churches that were very much oriented towards ministries to the LGBTQ populations of the time. But he also had the Psychedelic Peace Fellowship, which was a religious organization dedicated to the psychedelic experience, and he would do LSD bad trip intervention in the New York area, and had a hotline where if people were having a bummer, as they called them then, they could call him or one of his associates, and they would be over with, counsel them and help them, or even talk them down on the phone. And Itkin's a fascinating character. There's a whole book about him called The Radical Bishop and Gay Consciousness, but weirdly enough, the book does not once mention his work with the Psychedelic Peace Fellowship. He was associated with Timothy Leary and in Millbrook for a while, and helped him write one of his Death of the Mind performance art pieces, which is called the Resurrection of Jesus Christ. These people were around. These people and organizations were around at the time, because this was a very real, big issue, and I think still is. I think people still have, who are not being careful, still have bad experiences with the entheogens, and it's something we know a lot more about now. And there are organizations like Dance Safe for the rave community that deal with people having bad experiences, or people who have taken the drugs or chemicals that are less than pure and are having medical issues there. This is something that really, I think, started in the 60s with some of the people and organizations I discuss in Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, and has now become much more respectable and much more sanctioned as a form of therapy and as a form of healing.
Yeah, the hog farm at Woodstock, Wavy Gravy, Hugh Romney, Nobody for President, also that was also his kind of a role, taking people down from bad trips. I tried to get him on the show, but he wanted to promote Hillary Clinton for president. I said, okay, well, thank you. Let's see if I can book you in the future. Let me ask you a question. Yeah. He's just done all sorts of good work over the years, and I guess that was just one of the things, was that kind of healing work. Another thing that really stimulated, I think, the use of the practice of entheogenic healing people who are having bad entheogenic experiences besides raves was Burning Man. Right. Because the sheer number of people out there that are doing LSD or Molly or what have you means that you're going to, by law of averages, you're going to have a certain amount of them who are not having a good experience and need to be brought down, need to be healed, and I think that's just been a real proving ground for a lot of this work. I've been to Burning Man 3 times, and I can tell you, when you've got like 60, 70, 80,000 people there, and probably at least half of them are tripping, you're going to have possibly hundreds of people that where
there are going to be issues, and the issues have to be addressed psychologically and physiologically.
Yeah, I would love to check out Burning Man. I have hard contact lenses, though, and that dust would get in my lenses. It would just be brutal on my eyes. What about, we had mentioned earlier about with these cults and these churches, and we had speculated about, are they fronts for, like, intelligence operations spooks? But now what about, and you mentioned one group that had a lot of internal strife. And when we see that internal strife in these groups, very often that's a COINTELPRO type of disruption. Any indication of on the one hand, we have, hey, are these COINTELPRO operations? On the other hand, is there COINTEL disruption of these groups?
Well, I think anytime you get two or more human beings together, you're going to have internal strife. Yeah. When you get it as an organized group, you're really going to get it. There's going to be everything from disputes about leadership to disputes about doctrine to disputes about practices to money issues to sexual issues. That just comes with the territory, and that's not just in religions, that's political movements, that's just about everything. You're going to have that. And I think in this world it gets amplified because people are having these very extreme and life-changing experiences, and so the octane of the drama is going to be amped up quite a bit. As far as outsiders coming in and causing trouble, it's possible. I mean, I think there was definitely penetration of Timothy Leary's groups. Yeah. There was definitely penetration of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. Very early in the Native American Church's history, there were attempts by government agents to wipe them out because they saw peyote as just as bad or even worse for the American Indian community as alcohol was and is, and that their efforts came to naught mainly because of the writings and work of a white anthropologist named James Mooney, who really kind of helped them to represent themselves as a legitimate religious organization, peyote as a good healing path for Native Americans. It really depends. I think so many of these groups have been just so far on the fringes that the spooks and cops have not really been interested in them. I mean, one group I discuss in Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches is the Temple of the True Inner Light, who you may remember from your days in New York in the 80s and 90s. This was a storefront church in Manhattan that gave out DPT, which is a legal entheogen, to their followers and to anybody who was interested and who was interviewed by them and approved. And they were completely left alone by the law, I think partly because the substance they are using is legal, and partly because the New York police and Fed and the drug feds around there just had their hands full trying to stem the cocaine and heroin trades. They didn't want to bother with a few hippies in the Lower East Side doing this weird legal entheogen. And I get into their story in Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches as well, and their links to some very macabre and strange happenings in the whole New York underground of that time, which is, I think, since vanished because of the tremendous gentrification of Manhattan and now increasingly Brooklyn. You just don't have these hipster ghettos anymore there. But when they did, they thrived there, and they're still around, but they're just very, very low profile now.
I just saw where they just sold the Hells Angels headquarters in Lower East Side. Some like $7 million, some insane amount of money. Yeah. You know, it's just, my God, when I think back to the old days. We're running low on time, but you had mentioned off the air that you did a chapter about the Church of the Realized Fantasy, Mickey Cesar. Oh, and by the way, for the record, the first time when I was with the Yippies in New York City, and the official line with the Yippies back in 1976, 1979, 80, around that time, as far as Timothy Leary went, was that he was an agent, and that even as far as his escape from that mental institution, which was aided by the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. Right. That's what do you call it? That when they showed up, he was at a bus stop, and he made this story up about how he climbed on a telephone wire, he was just sitting there at a bus stop when they picked him up. I know. No, but now, Church of the Realized Fantasy, okay? Mickey Cesar, 777-CASH. Somehow he's able to get this phone number, to dial a pot, dial a joint. He was running. And it became widely known with that murder, that fellow who murdered the ballerina and then cooked her up. And, right. And then
Daniel Rakovich.
Right, Rakovich, right. And at that time in the paper it said, well, they were doing rituals and ceremonies at his apartment there on Bleecker Street. This was a tiny little closet. And it wasn't even a window in this little apartment, And there was I never saw any ceremonies or rituals or even more than 2 or 3 people in there at any one time. How much are you concerned that the publications, the articles about these groups and these cults and these churches are kind of exaggerated?
I really stuck with what could be proven and what was known, and I did a little bit of speculation, but when I speculated, I framed it as such. Now, with Mickey Cesar, he did have a public place in the, I don't know if it was the Lower East Side or I think it was the Lower West Side meatpacking district, where people would gather and they'd smoke weed, and he'd sermonize them. He had allegedly some very sketchy stuff going on there as well, which I get into in the book. But I pretty much stick with the facts, stick with what is known. But a journalist named Mike Saget did a good long piece about Mickey Cesar and the Church of the Realized Fantasy, and he said, well, I went to their services, and there's 15 or 20 people sitting around there, and they're just smoking a joint, not saying a word. No orgies, no Satanism, no anything like that. And I think Rakovich was obviously crazy. He was kicked out of both the Church of the Realized Fantasy and the Temple of the True Inner Light, which I mentioned a couple minutes ago. I think his particular outrages at the time had nothing to do with either organization. He was just a fringe person who was hanging out with other fringe people and got brought into those two orbits. So,
now you said there was a location in the meatpacking district. And what year was that?
This would have been in the late 80s. It was a former comic store, I think over on 13th Street on the west side. I'm not real familiar with Manhattan geography, but that was where the public ceremonies would take place, and they were apparently pretty low key, at least in the public ones. I do not know what went on when the doors were closed and the inner circle was doing its stuff.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, I'm totally unaware of that. I was aware of his little tiny studio apartment, which had this phone number where there was no lease to that apartment. These guys because who was that guy? The phone freak, Captain Crunch.
Captain Crunch,
yeah. Who, by the way, has a lot of medical problems right now. Too. Lived in Vegas for a while too. He had their phones, instead of with no record of them or anything like that. This guy it was just amazing what these guys were pulling off down there. But Mickey was in this tiny little studio, getting arrested all the time, man, for marijuana. And I mentioned to you off the air too. I was a member of NAMBLA and had this fascination with Eitan Pates, that he had a framed copy of the Eitan Pates missing persons poster. In his apartment there.
Yeah, it's the crossing over of fringe worlds. Yeah. And in Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, I discuss him and Michael Itkin, who was a pedophile. I mean, this is established. And then another really wild character who is all over the narrative of psychedelic churches cults and outlaw churches, and did eventually get busted and do some time for that particular crime. So I think, really, if you're starting a religion, and if you're starting a religion that is based on using illegal substances, you're going to be a pretty out there character. You are not going to be a mainstream person. And the problem with people that are not mainstream often is that, along with being very creative and very brave and very blazing new paths for the human experience, they can often be really messed up personally.
So true. Yeah.
And and I get into the biographies of these entheogenic church founders in psychedelic cults and outlaw churches, and a lot of them had some big personal issues, and one of them really, at least one of them in there, they kind of spilled out into their spiritual practices, and they weren't very good at compartmentalizing their lives, and so things just became a mess after a while, as it often does become with people that are creative and maverick in their personality. They just their lives are often messes.
You know, it's so true. Just as you said that now, just thinking back, so many of these people today would be just totally homeless. You know, because back then you could live cheap, and crash on people's couches and have little communes and stuff. But today you just couldn't survive. Mike Marinacci, we're out of time. We had about 1 minute left. Now you can find Mike Marinacci on Instagram at Psychedelic Cults, and this group too is on Facebook. You could find the Psychedelic Cults
and outlaw churches.
What do you want to leave us with in a minute?
I'd like to leave you with I'd like people to read the book Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, and just kind of consider the spiritual diversity we have in America, and the changing face of what looks like religion and spirituality in America, and how the use of entheogens has been a part of that, and seems to be growing even more visible all the time. And this is something I tried to capture in the book, capture its history and what it looks like now and where it's going, and not advocate the use of any of these substances. I don't do that, but I do advocate people looking into this as a path, as an alternative, and as an expression of human spirituality and the human need to connect to God, whatever you define that as.
You can get this book on pre-order. You go to Amazon, Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, LSD, Cannabis, and Spiritual Sacraments in Underground America. Like I said, pre-order, you get a big discount there. And if Mike Marinacci says that this is his favorite book, he's the most proud of this work, you got to look. This is a guy who's been around a while. California Jesus, Mysterious California, Weird California. These are all really well-respected books here. Mike Marinacci's been around a long time, very well-known. You can check out our archives, like I said, a previous book we did with him about Mysterious California. Mike, man, thank you so much. I'd love to have you back soon, too, to fill us in more on your exploration of this whole world.
Thank you, Ed.
No, thank you, man.
Yeah, thank you. I love your show. Always enjoy listening to your guests, and I feel honored to be on it.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. Good night.
Okay. Good night.